Hey, all right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our weekly medical grand rounds. Before we begin, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that we are located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to enrich our vibrant community. So we have a very different grand rounds today, really more around some of the regulatory things, I guess, related to some of the work we do. And so I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Navisha Cates, who recently concluded her postdoc fellow in the Faculty of Law at the University of Alberta. She mapped and analyzed research activity and the perspectives of patients, researchers, and clinicians for the clinical translation and market authorization of regenerative medicine products and therapies. Dr. Case is also a cognitive scientist. Her doctoral training is in psychiatry research at McGill University, and her master's is in medical science with a focus on clinical neuroscience at the University of Calgary. She's on the board of directors for the Howell Experience and co-leads the mentorship subcommittee of the Afro-Descendant Leadership Alliance's Black Wealth Club. As a former One Young World Scholar with Johnson & Johnson, Dr. Case has led research on impact frameworks for clinical research. She's also an alumna of the Montreal hub of the World Economic Forum's Global Shapers community, where she served as vice curator in 2022. In recognition of her commitment to global health equity through her career in volunteerism, Dr. Case is the 2023 recipient of the Alberta Council for Global Cooperation's Top 30 Under 30 Award and 2024 recipient of the Peaks Emerging Leaders in Healthcare. And she tells me that she's trying to disseminate this work sort of globally, particularly to medical audiences. And so I guess we will be a little bit of a test case for her. And so I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Case.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. As you can hear from my bio, my background is in medical science. And so this is more of a home for me than law, which is where I branched over to. And so I'm going to be sharing with you a little bit about the research that I've done on therapies that are using a patient's own stem cells. Okay, got it. All right. Yeah. Okay, so for today, I'm going to be going through a bit of the background and context of this research, and then I'm going to be specifically sharing some findings from a patient survey study that we did, and then sharing some implications for physicians and healthcare providers. So I have no conflict of interest to disclose. Okay, so getting into the background now. Okay. All right, so I'm going to start off by presenting an excerpt from a 2019 article from the Washington Post, and it says, in the summer of 2015, ophthalmologist Thomas Albini examined a patient who had suddenly lost vision in both eyes. The woman, 78, had macular degeneration and had visited a Miami clinic offering a new treatment, injections of stem cells made from her abdominal fat. Instead of getting better, the woman's vision deteriorated significantly. Peering into her eyes, Albini said he saw clumps of blood floating inside. And so this presents an example of some of the challenges that we've seen with treatments that are using a patient's own stem cells. And this is an example from the US, but these are examples that are also happening in Canada as well. And there are numerous stories like it. And so what are these stem cell therapies? So there are two main types of stem cell therapies that we have. So the first type is allogeneic. And so these are stem cell therapies that are derived, the cells are derived from a donor. and delivered to the patient. And then we have autologous stem cell therapies, which is what the focus of my presentation will be on. And so this is where the cells are derived from the patient's own body, and they're manufactured and administered back to that same patient. Now, from a regulatory perspective, just from looking at this image, can you see some of the issues or the main issue that there might be from a regulatory perspective for autologous stem cell therapies? So the standard of quality is the main area that regulators would be concerned with when it comes to the autologous cell-based therapies. And so what has happened is that in 2019, Health Canada put out a position paper stating where autologous cell-based therapies fit in the regulatory system. And so as we know, we have medical devices, we have biologics and drugs. And then the question was, where do these autologous cell-based therapies fit? And so Health Canada put out this position paper saying that they've got a new category called advanced therapeutic products that they're funneling these autologous cell-based therapies into. And so this is a new regulatory area. It does fall within biologics, but it's less standardized and less well established as those other pathways. And so what we end up having is a situation where the sponsors of clinical trials are having to have a bit more back and forth with the regulators, and it's a more ad hoc kind of process at the moment until it's better established. And so this is just a overview, as I said. So the Food and Drugs Act, and then within that we have medical device regulations, and then we have the Food and Drug Regulations, which is what the biologics fall under. And then now you can see over here, they've added this advanced therapeutics pathway, and they're calling it a sandbox because it's still not very well established, and they're still trying to figure out what those regulations are going to look like. And so we have a blank slate here for that sandbox for now. Okay, so when it comes to establishing a new regulatory framework or pathway, who are some of the key actors that should be involved in that process? Well, first of all, patients should be at the center of designing what that looks like. Then we have researchers as well, regulators, and of course, healthcare providers. So working together in concert. Okay, so that brings me to that first set of key actors, which are patients. So that's going to be the focus of the bulk of my presentation, which is on a patient survey that we conducted. And so the research aims of this survey was to look at the context in which patients are accessing regenerative medicines, and also the ethical and legal regulatory context that that's happening in. And then also, what are their experiences with autologous cell-based therapies, and what is their knowledge, and what are their perceptions associated with that as well. So to conduct this survey, we looked primarily at individuals who already had received or were in the process of receiving autologous cell-based therapies, or ACBT. And for the recruitment, we recruited mostly on social media platforms. It was a 10-minute survey that they could fill out online. And so the final data set for that was 101 responses. And then for the data analysis, we used chi-square tests for the quantitative data. And then for the qualitative data, we looked at themes that emerged from it using in vivo. And so I'll just give you a picture of who these participants are, first of all. So the majority of the participants received autologous human fibroblasts, autologous fat transplants, or serum therapies. And the majority of them learned about these therapies from their healthcare provider. And we found that most of the healthcare providers were physicians. They were mostly seeking it for sports injuries, osteoarthritis, with a smaller number for cosmetic or other reasons. And then physicians were also the primary way that the participants found out about the treatment and were told about the treatment to begin with. So we can see now that physicians play a really important role in that patient journey in finding out about these autologous cell-based therapies. So through the consent process of receiving these therapies, we see that the purpose of the treatment was explained quite well to the patients, or that it was explained, and also that they were informed about any side effects as well. So informed consent seemed all good from that angle. Then what we see is that so the majority of patients were told that the treatment they were receiving was a medical procedure, with a smaller number receiving it as part of a clinical trial. Now, in terms of the participants' knowledge on the regulations, they were informed. The majority of them were informed about how it's regulated, and also the evidence for the treatment was explained. What's a little more interesting is this spread in variability in terms of their knowledge on the evidence for the treatment. And so we're seeing a wider spread on that, whereby the primary ways that they're being informed about the evidence of the treatment is through the treatment provider's clinical experience and through peer-reviewed scientific research. However, we're seeing a smaller number of that research being from RCTs, from randomized clinical controlled trials. And then we're seeing quite a bit of participants' knowledge about these treatments actually coming from testimonials from other patients. So not necessarily as reputable of a source for the evidence of the treatment. Then what we did was divided up the participants based on whether they received the treatment as a clinical trial or as part of a medical procedure. And so here we found that the majority of the patients who received it as part of a medical procedure did not think that the treatment should be provided without going through clinical trials or regulations. Interestingly, they also said that if they were to learn that the treatment did not go through clinical trials and was not approved by a regulator, that it would change their perception of the treatment. So I'll talk a little bit more about this soon as well, but what this is essentially indicating is an assumption that may be had by the participants that whatever they are being provided by their treatment provider is something that has gone through clinical trials and regulatory approval, even if it hasn't necessarily. And then when they were asked whether they would recommend the treatment to someone else, most were saying yes. Okay, so what does this actually mean for physicians? So we're seeing from these findings that healthcare providers and physicians in particular are playing a key role in the patient journey. And so we saw from the data that I presented that the healthcare providers are the main source of that information that the patients are learning about these autologous cell-based therapies from. And so there's a key role there in terms of information. And so the informational practices during the clinical encounter, we found that the informed consent process was good in the sense that physicians were providing the necessary information to their patients. However, we didn't directly assess the quality or the accuracy of that information. So that's some potential future work that could be explored a little bit more. What we did find is that there seemed to be some gaps in the regulatory knowledge, as I mentioned. And so there was an assumption among the participants that the medical procedures that were that were provided by the physicians were under the purview of regulatory approval. The other thing is that they weren't well informed on the type of regulatory body that they thought was responsible for the autologous cell-based therapies. And so designing that informational process so that the patients have more awareness about the regulatory perspective on that would be important. And the reason why that's important, it's important for all treatments, of course, but for something like autologous cell-based therapies, it's even more important because the regulatory environment is just emerging and still evolving. And so it's an important point for building trust between patients and their healthcare providers, especially coming out of a situation like COVID, for example, where we saw that trust being broken down. This area is particularly important for maintaining that trust going forward. And then, so another area that we found as well is that I believe it was, so there were 45 of the participants who received the autologous cell-based therapies through clinical trials, and 91% of them had to pay to participate in those clinical trials. So that presents ethical issues. And there's some red flags there in terms of it being skewed towards including patients who are have the means to participate in those clinical trials. And so you can see it skewing certain demographics that are included in there, and also just compromising the scientific integrity of those clinical trials as well. And so those concerns are there as well. Many of the healthcare providers who are doing these clinical trials, though, the clinical trials are not a main part of what they do. Providing the treatment is the main part of their practice. And so hopefully those effects won't be long lasting beyond this. Okay, so we dove a little bit into the patient surveys, and then as the next part of this research that is still ongoing is on the perspective of researchers and healthcare providers. So that's a study that we've conducted interviews for. So we've interviewed a number of clinicians and researchers and found out what their experience was in going through the regulatory process, particularly because this is a newer area that isn't as well established. And so for that study, it's a separate study that's complementary to this one. That one is the data collection's complete, but still just analyzing and writing that up. Yeah, so that's the complementary study, and I'm open to questions.
Dr. Gibson.
Yes. First, can we put sarcastic air quotes around clinical trials here? Because I think they're necessary. So is the Declaration of Helsinki just not a thing in this field?
It is. It is. I think where the contention lies is that a lot of the healthcare providers are arguing that these autologous cell-based therapies are actually just part of regular medical practice. And so
Just not true. That is an outright lie. That's just absolutely not the case, is it?
Yeah. So there's been a lot of tension and pushback between, excuse me, so between the treatment providers who are saying, many of whom are saying, there's division, of course, but many are saying that it's just part of regular medical practice. And then regulators, on the other hand, are saying, actually, we need to make sure about safety and efficacy before we can allow participants, or sorry, patients to be able to receive these therapies. So there's a lot of tension.
I suppose that's the key part of my rather pithy question is we have a very well understood pathway through animal research, phase 1 trials, phase 2 trials, phase 3 trials. And we have the Declaration of Helsinki, we have the Health Research Ethics Boards, we have we have the CPSA regulations around healthcare providers and their ethical actions. We have the university in Alberta, and similar regulations elsewhere. To get someone to pay to be in a clinical trial for an unproven treatment based on evidence that injecting your eyes with your own fat is somehow going to make it better is so out with that. So why does this get a pass on that? Because any other clinical trial would have been shut down within minutes.
Absolutely. And so it doesn't get a free pass from the regulatory standpoint. So that's why in 2019, Health Canada put out those that position paper stating clearly where they stand on it, that it does require clinical trials. From the patient perspective, though, these are patients who are suffering from a variety of different ailments. They're eager to get treatment. And so there is this desire to get it as quickly as possible. And so there's a lot of pushback and tension there.
The existence of plane crashes doesn't mean we should take magic carpets, does it?
Right.
Well, I think to be fair, though, Dr. Case's point here is that this is happening, that we need to be aware of it, and we need to advise, our patients accordingly. Now, what you may or may not know is that we actually see the complications not infrequently of these types of so-called trials or treatments or what have you. And so just getting back to Dr. Gibson's point is, what are the implications in when these treatments are being offered? And in particular, I'm going to make maybe a controversial comment here and say that, I know for a fact that in south of the border, there are a number of institutions that are promising patients various outcomes that are not necessarily evidence-based, haven't gone through regulatory processes and so on and so forth. We end up with these folks with their complications north of the border.
I see.
And so what is the fallback for us in terms of what we're able to provide and sort of follow up on that? I mean, obviously we treat the patient, but it's just a continuing process. And so do you have any advice from that perspective?
Not advice per se, but I would echo that. And one thing that I neglected to mention earlier in the presentation is that about 3/4 of the participants in that patient survey had received the treatment in the US, and a quarter of them in Canada. And so medical tourism and stem cell tourism is something that is becoming more prevalent. And so especially in a regulatory environment in Canada where it's a little bit more difficult now, and other markets like the US have commodified it a lot more, and it's easier to just pay your way and get those treatments. That is happening more, and it's also happening in other countries as well in Global South. You can go to Mexico and get a
Correct.
treatment or et cetera. So,
Yeah, and so I think from our perspective, I mean, it's very clear that those of us that practice in this type of setting, you know, clearly are aware, but I think what would be really helpful is to know sort of what are the, you know, what tools do we have to sort of follow up on when we see these types of complications and things. I mean, you know, you've given the example of stem cell, but there's still radiation therapy. There's all kinds of treatments that are being offered to patients willing to pay.
Yeah.
And I don't know what consequences there are to those outfits.
I'm not sure. Unfortunately, it adds to the medical system already being overburdened when this happens. So I'm not sure what the recourse for that is, unfortunately. But
well,
hopefully,
you know, I know you worked with Dr. Caulfield on this, but I mean, education obviously is going to be a huge part of this, right?
Yes.
And so have you, what have you undertaken in terms of educating the public and getting the word out there?
So we haven't done much as yet, but that's part of the key actors that we want to pay attention to. And so getting the information from the patients through this survey was a key part of understanding first where they're coming from in terms of what knowledge gaps that they might have. And so then we can use that information to then go out and address those knowledge gaps more in a more targeted way.
Well, I think it is very helpful for us to have that information to understand that patients don't necessarily. The slide that I really liked was the one that talked about what the patient would have liked in terms of when they were accepting therapy, whether or not it had gone through a regulatory process. Now, some still said no, it was a small number, but some still said it didn't matter that it hadn't gone through regulatory processes, but the majority said they would.
Yeah.
And so I think if we can target our education in, you know, that way.
Precisely.
I mean, we know that some patients will still go, right?
Yeah.
We have an obligation to educate, so.
Yeah, and the healthcare providers definitely play a key role in providing that information, especially you want it to it's better coming from the healthcare provider than coming from patient testimonials. So trying to mitigate that as well, because a lot of their information is coming from testimonials.
I mean, we know that for many interventions, smoking cessation, alcohol, all the rest of it, that it is really, you know, the healthcare provider discussion that likely has the largest impact. So,
exactly.
Yeah. All right. Well, with that, I think we're going to give people some time back this morning. So thank you, Dr. Case, on behalf of the department for presenting this important information.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.